educational video, I'm very pleased to be joined by Mike Piker, who has over 30 years experience in global HR, total rewards, and talent mobility. Mike and I have known each other for many, many years and always enjoyed a lot of very in-depth discussions. And one topic Mike has shared his knowledge with me is the pressure that the financial markets and investors have put on corporations to act sustainably. It's important that we all understand where this pressure is coming from and why, as this pressure is and will continue to flow down through all companies and supply chains with increasing urgency. So we must all be prepared in the mobility industry. Mike, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely delighted to be here.
Thank you. So Mike, there is much talk about the financial institutions influencing large corporations to take, meaningful sustainability and to take it serious and reduce their negative environmental impact. What's the background to this? Where did it start?
So in my research, Paul, it started, I believe, in 1972. So there is a well-known rating agency called MCSI, and they began their ESG research around that time. And essentially, Paul, they look at, as you're familiar with proxy reports that companies prefer to, obviously, independent agencies. CSR reports came into vogue in the last 10, 15 years, as you know. Shareholder results in the States where I'm from, we have what are called 10K filings. And then there are voluntary ESG disclosures, which have been really improving dramatically in the last 10 plus years, as I mentioned. I personally have worked for 6 public companies in different industries in different countries. And as part of my role as head of reward and ops, it's been part of this disclosure evolution in my career, so I can speak to it personally. A couple of the things that just trolling through my my library research. So as you know, Paul, since 1972, the NGOs have been involved in this as well, big time, particularly the UN. So in this sphere, the particular angle is very useful because it's independent and they develop and define what the measures are per se. So just recalling for the audience again, E stands for environment, obviously S is for social and G is for governance. But the metrics, there's a myriad of institutions. So there's one that's called the Global Reporting Initiative. It's an independent body, provides metrics to public companies, FTSEs, for example. There's what's called a Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, another institution. There's another one in integrated reporting. There's one on carbon disclosure. There's even one on an esoteric topic on task force on climate-related financial disclosures, TCFD. And the one we all know is the famous UN Sustainable Development Goals. Again, preferred and brokered in the last 10 years. Another interesting angle from a government standpoint, the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the US EPA report on ECG for their respective countries, as I'm sure you know. And recently my country, John Kerry, who's a former senator and Secretary of State for my country, is Biden's first US special envoy for the climate, appointed by the first US president. So that's a pretty big deal. And finally, it's a tangential sort of thing. The Business Roundtable is really a forum of the most prestigious CEOs of public companies. It's been around since the 50s, very famous. Basically, they got together August 19th, 2019, and declared to the world that the revised purpose of a corporation is not just to serve stakeholders, but to create value for all our stakeholders. So 181 CEOs signed that statement. So just again, stakeholder is as or more important than shareholders. And in my humble view, all that was a turning point.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I mean, that's really powerful. And thank you for that, because it just shows to people, that this started in the 70s and just how serious and widespread this is, because people need to understand, because to me, this was the real catalyst. When I found this out and you explained more to me, was I thought, wow, this is so serious, and why it's coming through business is so meaningful, but so quickly, and why it's sweeping into global mobility and our industry so quickly, and why the urgency is. But can you share some recent examples of the actions investors have taken to increase sustainability in corporations, and the role that those rating agencies have played as well?
Yeah, so there, as you know, Paul, there's been a lot going on in this recently, particularly in 2021. So many of the audience knows very well, Fitch, Moody's, S&P are the very famous rating agencies, which essentially institutional investors rely upon to invest their assets. And they're really stepping up their focus on ESG ratings. So just to reaffirm again, the audience probably knows it, but there's estimated to be, again, $12 trillion of US ESG focused assets, and approximately 30 trillion with a big T of global ESG focused assets. So the big boys, as I call them, BlackRock, Vanguard, UBS, Fidelity, increasingly have appointed ESG not only leaders, but big departments that really focus within their firms to direct investments towards ESG adherent public companies. And that's serious money that, frankly, company boards, CEOs and CFOs must answer to. But specifically to address your really important question, some industries are particularly scrutinized due to their climate change impact and pollution and waste. And no surprise, it's oil and gas. So just to cut to the chase, oil and gas specifically, if I may name names now, Royal Dutch Shell, ExxonMobil, BP, and Chevron have hit a tipping point, spurred on really by a mix of environmentalists, pension fund managers, and investors. So this year, I live, for example, I'm in Amsterdam now in the Netherlands, biggest public company in my country here. And Shell was instructed by a Dutch court that they must cut greenhouse gas emissions this decade. And that has never happened before for a company of that size. Parenthetically, at a recent ExxonMobil shareholder meeting in Texas, an investor rebellion actually took place that was focused on the company to move away from oil and gas profits, or investors will really spur or spurn, if you will, further investment. That was a big deal. And then Chevron, another famous ONG, told the company bluntly to reduce its own emissions, but also the emissions produced, interestingly enough, by its customers. Yeah. So not just what the company produces, but down the consumer chain. So those three, in my humble view, that's a tipping point.
Yeah, Mike, and they're great examples there as well. And one thing that I took away from Shell as well, that the court found that were instructed Shell that they were actually responsible for their extended supply chain. And also with Exxon, in the end, having 3 board members removed, it's, it just shows the speed and the urgency, as you say, from the investors, the pension funds, wider stakeholders, activists, hedge funds, and how quickly this pressure can build. And I think, again, that's why it's coming, so quickly from the boards have made, commitments. And I think they're now very wary of perhaps they didn't calculate all of their extended supply chain, the carbon footprint, and the environmental impacts. And they know if they miss some of their targets, the share price could go down. They could get removed by an activist investor. I mean, it's a huge boiling pot of pressure there in these corporations, isn't it? It's
very tangible now. Yeah. You think about even I looked at a sort of a list of the most valuable assets owned by a particular company on their balance sheet. And if I looked at the 2 and 3 were Shell and Exxon. So you think demonstrably both asset, industry impact, and the visibility and the precedence. Those 4 parameters, back to my point, it's somewhat of a tipping point. And let's see how it plays out.
Yeah, and it sounds all of this is adding up, that basically boards, have no choice but to comply. And where do you see the future direction for corporate ESG practice? Where's this going?
So a bit of a somber note there. So let me first start with, yeah, so I think the reporting and analytics will continue unabated, but we need to be aware of the raw materials to produce, for example, environmentally conscious products are going to face supply bottlenecks, unintended consequences. So give you an example. So Tesla, we all know very well, Elon Musk's company, they face bottlenecks producing batteries because there's a limited supply of lithium. Lithium is one of the most expensive materials, mostly in China and in a couple other countries. And the energy required to produce battery cells is not inconsequential. So this is where I'm going with this. You can go down the route, but the law of unintended consequences can actually go the other direction. Another point, in my humble view, ESG measurement is going to explode, and it is. However, my somber point is June, there was a recent HBR article that said it really well. And I quote from the article, "We're confusing output with impact," quote unquote. So my view is measurement and reporting has exploded. Carbon emissions, environmental damage continue, though, to get worse. And there's a lack of comparability in the ratings. So the ones I mentioned before, if you're comparing a public corporation, they can actually choose which rating agency and which rating parameter they wish to adhere to. So if you want to compare on a FTSE Unilever to BP, I will tell you right now, are not necessarily using the same rating. So the comparability is not there. So government funding for carbon capture, renewables infrastructure, that's in Biden's new bill, which just passed the Senate over the weekend. But my point is, in short, the markets, frankly, are not enough to solve the societal problem. It's got to be a compact, NGOs, governments, and companies, and probably a lot of others, environmentalists, obviously, too. So yeah, I've got a mixed sort of sense of where it may go.
Yeah, Mike, and you give some very sound advice there and thoughts, and I concur with that. And I do see, that this industry of ESG has actually grown up. That, to your point, there are so many companies out there that can help you measure this, help you report this. And I've spoken to a number of them, and there are some which are charitable organizations, non-for-profit, and there's some really meaningful people behind that want to do the right thing and help people. But I just think people need to be aware, because suddenly it can get very complex. It can get very costly. What some of these companies, and also the big four, have latched onto this. This is going to be a huge growth area for them.
Big time.
Yeah, and it's but I think the opportunity for our industry on the mobility side is a lot of people in there are, very grounded people. They deliver hugely, quality service. They don't do anything unless it delivers something more to the client or the relocating employee. And I just think it's a huge opportunity for the industry. I think they will come at this not from a marketing perspective, but what can we really do? What's meaningful? And take meaningful, small steps. But how do you see that? Are there any sort of takeaways that you would give for the industry?
Yeah, as we discussed, I think the other day, if perhaps, let's say the upcoming, workforce symposium at ERC, and you had Bill Grable or 3 or 4 and Plus and Cardis maybe sitting on stage and maybe saying in front of a very large audience, we declare as an industry that we are going to increase transparency of our supply chain, renewable sources, so pulling and packing and bubble wrap and transport logistics and container ships, that the disclosure on the supply ecosystem is suddenly more transparent, that renewables is paramount, and that maybe a third party, you source renewable products as opposed to each vendor sourcing it independent of one another. So the power of pooled sourcing in and of itself for an industry, I think, could be potentially an angle. And sourcing leaders, and I've had them in my teams at 6 companies and soon to be a 7th, is sourcing wants to know how green the supply chain is. So if my mobility team sources a DSP and RMC, the first question will now be, what's their ESG rating. And if it's not at the level of that company's internal bar, then that contract will not be sourced. So
Yeah,
those are
Mike,
just some tips.
yeah, I really appreciate that, and again, wise words. And you know, to pick up on a point you made there about collaboration, because I do feel, and in another video for the educational series with Ben Ivory of Grable, you know, we were talking about the power of collaboration, and I think the industry could do some huge things, collaborate, you know, and just share resources, share ideas, because to make something meaningful, particularly around the reusable, potentially reusable packing materials, etc. You know, join forces, collaboration could completely transport this industry to a very sustainable place. So yeah, I'm totally with you on that. Yeah, but Mike,
So let's make it happen.
yeah, absolutely. Everybody out there, you know, start talking, collaborate, share your ideas, and also don't be afraid to start small, you know. But the idea of this today, thank you, Mike, was just so to get that history and where that urgency is coming from. If anybody was thinking, you know, it's not that serious, companies aren't really going to drive this, it won't reach down to our level. It's here, it's coming, and it's just going to be here with increased urgency.
Awesome.
Yeah. Mike, thanks so much.
You're
Appreciate your
most
time.
welcome. It was great to be here. Thank you, sir.